Good afternoon. Thank you for your patience, for your wisdom, and for being here. This has not been easy. This has been an incredibly difficult trial. And, Mr. McAleese was saying correctly that the law does not require that the state prove motive to show guilt beyond a reasonable doubt with respect to murder. But that's not why we're here. We're here for that sole core question, and that is why? Why did this happen? So the law doesn't require motive to show murder. But you heard from the experts that lack of motive is evidence of insanity. The law doesn't require that you love someone in order to get married, right? But would you do it? Would you marry someone you didn't love? That's our reason and that's our common sense. That's what we have to look at. So we bring that into the courtroom when we're considering why, what happened here. So we're going to start with the law. And the judge is going to give you written jury instructions, so you don't have to write any of this down. And again, if I say something that's different than what the judge says, she's the boss. Follow her instructions. But I believe what she's going to tell you is NGRI. And the law is to establish the defense of insanity. The defendant must prove by the greater weight of the evidence that at the time of the offense, she did not know, as a result of a severe mental disease, the wrongfulness of her act. And you're going to get an instruction about what kind of insanity qualifies in Ohio for not guilty by reason of insanity. And you'll hear this instruction. Insanity may be of short or long duration. The test for insanity remains the same irrespective of its duration. Whether a form of temporary insanity exists in this case is a question of fact for you to decide, for you as ladies and gentlemen of the jury. So we've worked on a decision tree, a chart that I think mirrors the instruction, that I think and I hope will give you some guidance into how you do your job. And what the instruction tells us is to start with this first question. Did the state prove beyond a reasonable doubt all of the elements of the offenses charged? If no, we're done, not guilty. If you find that the state did prove beyond a reasonable doubt all of the elements of all the offenses, then the next question is, did the defense prove by a preponderance of the evidence the defense of insanity? And remember, the judge is going to give you the instruction and the definition of preponderance. Preponderance is much lower than beyond a reasonable doubt. Preponderance is tipping the scales ever so slightly in favor of the defense. 51% versus 49%. More likely than not. So we have the burden of proving to you that it is more likely than not that on the date of the offense, Ms. Powell suffered from a serious mental disease, schizophrenia. And as a result of that, she did not know the wrongfulness of her conduct. If you find that we have met that burden and proved that, then your verdict must be not guilty by reason of insanity. If we did not prove it, guilty. So let's look at what we have. We have three experts that the defense brought to you, Dr. Swales, Dr. Reardon, and Dr. Tinney, who together have a combined level of experience of 100 years, nearly 100 years. Combined, the three of them spent nearly 50 hours with Sidney Powell, not just talking to her, but also performing the valid, objective, verifiable psychological tests that help come to the decision in this case. They did that and offered their opinion to you. We heard from Dr. Obradovich today. And Dr. Obradovich said, well, you really can't use any testing to determine whether or not someone was insane at the time of the offense. You really can't use any testing that someone was malingering at the time of the offense. But she tried to tell you that her test, her interview of Sydney tells her that she was malingering back on March 3rd, 2020. Remember she said that from the witness stand? Oh, I think she was malingering back on March 3rd, 2020. But she can't tell you whether or not she was suffering from a severe mental disease at that time, because those tests don't really count. They really don't tell us anything. That's what you've got to consider. So you heard from the doctors, you heard from witnesses, and they use this word prodromal. Prodromal is early signs and symptoms of a mental health disorder. Early signs and symptoms of a mental health disorder. Well, what have we heard during the testimony? What have we seen during this trial? We heard that there were these telltale signs of schizophrenia, and they started long before we ever got to this courtroom. We heard from some corroborating witnesses. Amanda Brown. Amanda Brown told you she was friends with Sydney from before school even started, that summer gym, before 9th grade at St. B. And she described where Sydney started in 9th grade and kind of where she ended in 12th grade. And said she started out as this kind of bubbly person with a bubbly personality and ended much more withdrawn. You heard from Amanda that there were signs and symptoms of mental health. These are the prodromal signs that started before the deep psychotic break on March 3rd. She talks about her junior year being so despondent that Sydney wasn't really going out with anyone, with her friend group. She wasn't talking to anyone outside that friend group. She wouldn't go to restaurants, malls, or the movie theater. And Lauren Curry backed that up. Lauren Curry said that. That's the corroborative evidence. Why? Why do you think Sydney wasn't doing that? It's because of those voices. Those voices were telling her, you're a failure, you're a loser, you're nothing. That's why she didn't want to go out. We heard that she had this panic attack. And how was that corroborated? Not only did Amanda Brown experience it, Lauren Curry knew of it as well, who brought in the teacher, who saw it and experienced as well. Mrs. Milligan talked to you about that. And Amanda Brown also, I would submit to you, talked to you about those visual hallucinations that Sydney was experiencing. She called them visual hallucinations? No, she didn't. But she described to Amanda, these dreams, these really vivid, bizarre dreams. And she told Amanda, I don't know if they're in the daytime, I don't know if they're at nighttime, but Amanda told you that when Sydney would describe them to her, she was shaken for days. That's the corroboration of these visuals. Hallucinations, both audio and visual. That was there. We heard Lauren Curry say, Sydney had this anxiety in high school and it got worse in college. We heard Amanda Brown say, in the beginning of college, Sydney seemed like she was okay. She was happy to be there. By that third semester, she was withdrawn. Those voices were getting louder in Sydney's head. And the voices were turning to paranoia. And that's what caused the grades to fall. That's corroboration. That's the evidence. And you heard from witness after witness after witness about theories of how that could have happened, right? Well, some kids are involved in athletics and it's hard for them to manage their time. Well, some kids have a real hard time with the freedom of being on their own in college. Some kids just don't know how to manage time. None of that is present with Sydney. None of it. In fact, you heard Lauren Curry say, look, she didn't really skip school. I skipped once, and I don't think she skipped class more than me. And she tried. She was trying hard. She talked to you about this class that they had together. And I think it was the creative writing class. And she said we would sit down and we would study together. And Sydney was really trying. And I thought she did really well at that class. And I said to her, Ms. Curry, would you be surprised if I told you Sydney got an F in that class? And I think you saw her reaction from the witness stand. She was surprised today. Because it wasn't a lack of effort that was torpedoing Sydney's grades. Lauren Curry told you she wasn't out partying all the time. She had the one episode in 2018 about alcohol, but other than that, there's no evidence that that's what she was doing. Lauren Curry said it's not like she was staying out late, getting drunk, and too hungover to go to class. She told you that. This is the downward spiral. This is the corroboration that shows things are not going well for Sydney. This is more than just a kid who's struggling with the first year of college. Sydney goes from National Honor Society, 3.8 grade point average at St. Vincent, a student athlete, a leader in the community. And she graduates in May of 2018. And by her third semester at Mount Union, she's been expelled, suspended because of academic reasons. She goes from a 3.8 to a 2.21 to a 1.0 to suspended. That's not a downward spiral. That's corroboration of her mental health issues. That's what's causing this. You heard she's not really leaving the dorm room. Ms. Curry said, we had all these events in the sorority, and she only went to one that last semester. Ms. Curry told you, if she wasn't with me, she was really in the dorm, in her bed, on her phone. Why? It's because of those voices. Those voices are telling Sydney, you're a loser, you're a failure. Everybody else has their act together except for you. That's why she's not going outside. She believes that everyone is talking about her. She believes that everyone knows that she's a failure. And that's what's keeping her in her room. At some point, this lie gets too heavy, right? At some point, this idea that I'm just going to buy some more time. At some point, it's so difficult to live with that lie, you would think that a sane, rational person would set it down. So let's look at when that happened, right? Sydney is home for Christmas break. This is 2019. December 21st of 2019, you heard Ms. Gaffney testify. Sydney signed a letter, certified mail, to her house that said, you're on suspended. Academically, you are suspended from this university. So, I mean, what's the plan, right? What's Sydney's plan? That she's going to buy some time? Buy some time for what? That somehow she's going to just go back to school and they're going to say, oh, no, we changed our mind. That somehow she's going to go back to school and her dad's going to say, you know what? This is really cool. I guess you're going to school for free this semester. I don't have to pay any money. Nobody asked me for that money. That's her plan? That's not a plan. That's a delusion. And Sydney doesn't want to go back to school. You'll see text messages that we've produced that you'll have back there. Text messages between Brenda and Sydney on January 12th, the day before school starts on the 13th. And you heard there's some excitement among Sydney's friends to kind of go back to school. And that makes sense. They've been home with mom and dad. They opened up their Christmas presents. Now you're going back to school. But Sydney is up in her room. She's isolating. And she won't come out. And the only way Brenda can communicate with her is by texting her. Sydney, what's going on? You got to go. When are you going to go? What are you doing? Why are you staying up in your room until the moment before you got to leave? And now we know why Sydney was up there, because those voices were telling her. You're a failure. Everybody's got their life figured out except for you. And that's when the lie turned into something else. That's when it turned into pathology. Because it doesn't make any sense that she's going to get in the car and drive to Mount Union and just pretend to be a student and no one's going to figure that out. But she's convinced herself, this is what I can do. I can do this. And she gets in the car and she drives to Mount Union. And she's acting like everything is cool. And right from the beginning, it's not. Lauren said, well, Sydney's name wasn't on the door. The key card's not working. She doesn't seem to be enrolled in classes. I didn't see her with any real books. But the delusion is so strong. And Sydney can't face reality. So this false reality is created. To the point where when Miss Gaffney sees her and talks to her and says, Sydney, what are you doing? You're not enrolled here. Yes, I am. It kind of stopped Miss Gaffney in her tracks, and she had to look. Well, did I miss something? I mean, did she sign for that piece of paper? Was there an appeal that I'm aware of, not aware of? And she came back and said, no, Sydney, you're not enrolled here. No, I fixed it with emails. That's the delusion. Because what's the plan, right? What's the sane, rational plan? That Sydney's just going to talk her way out of being unenrolled with the Assistant Dean of Student Affairs in the Mount Union Administration Building? That's the plan? Does that make sense? So her reality comes crashing down. But she gets a week. Because the dean says, okay, your parents are on vacation, we'll activate your card. You got to be out in a week, though. So now this kind of delusional plan seems to be working. See, Lauren, I told you, my card works now. See, it was just a mistake. I fixed it. And life is okay. Life is fine. Everything's going to be okay. It's what Sydney's trying to tell herself. When at the same time, those voices are saying, it's not okay. It's not okay. People know you're a failure. And this is what is causing that delusion. It takes a second and finally a third meeting with the University of Mount Union administrators, Dean Gaffney and Dean Frazier. And finally, Dean Frazier had to say, look, if you don't go today, I'm going to call your parents. So this delusion has come crashing down. And she says, okay. And a new reality comes into play. Well, you know, Lauren, this is just my mom's decision and my decision. We decided together I should take some time off. I'm going to work. It's going to be great. We're going to live together in that townhouse next year. I'll be back. And she leaves. And what happened over that next week is not okay. What happened over that next week from the 24th to the 3rd is not normal. If that was any one of our daughters, we would be terrified. Rightfully so. What's going on with Sydney during that week? We know she's staying in a hotel at least 2 of those times. And you know, it's hard to piece things together. And I asked the lead detective, right, Detective Dave Whitten, who's got 30 years of experience, who's done 200 homicides, who's reviewed everything, all of the evidence, and supervised this case for some guidance. And I said, Detective Whitten, does it seem like Sydney would be living in her car? Is there any other evidence of any other explanation? No, that seems right. So it wasn't me coming up with this theory. This was Detective Whitten, the lead detective, telling you that's the best that we can construct. And was everything fine during that week that she's searching on the internet how to make quarters into money? That she's staying in these motels in Canton and Alliance? You know, Dr. Obradovich said, that everything was fine. I mean, I looked at her internet activity, and she's on TikTok, and she's looking up knock-knock jokes. That's how we assess a teenager's mental health, is looking at what they post on social media? looking at their text messages? Are you kidding me? Social media is poison. Poison. And everything a teenager does that they want to project on social media is, look at me, my life is great. Everything's so cool. That's not reality. That's not evidence in a murder trial to try to assess someone's sanity at the time of the offense. But even if you look at all those cell phone records, what human contact did Sydney have with someone in her support system? Human contact. I'm not saying text messages, everything's great. I'm not saying I'll send you a TikTok video, let me tell you a knock-knock joke. I'm talking about human contact where someone put their eyes on her and said, I think she's okay, or this is not good. None. None. Connor, the friend, says, are you going to go out? No, I'm not going out. Sydney was home. You'll look at those text messages and those cell phone records. Sydney went home early on in that week. And Brenda says, Sydney, 360, Life 360 says you're at home. What are you doing? And the delusion continues. Well, my professor is out on vacation, and I thought I'd come home for a little bit. And Brenda's like, no, you have more than one class on Tuesday. What are you doing? And can you imagine the voices in Sydney's head in that moment? Where she must feel that she can't even stay at home. Where living in your car in a hotel alone is better. That's where she's at. She's malingering sanity. That's what she's doing that week. She wants the world to think everything is fine, everything is okay. And that's not reality. It's not okay. But there's this one bright spot, right? 2 hours. Monday, March 2nd, 2 hours of watching The Bachelorette, where Sydney can go back to Mount Union. She can be with her friends. And for a couple of hours, they can do the girl things that they do. Laugh at The Bachelor. Order some ice cream. And you heard what Lauren said. She seemed fine. I mean, she was bubbly. She was laughing. Everything was okay. But everything wasn't okay. Because when Sydney waved goodbye and got in her car, she was homeless. She was broke. And she was alone. And she just left the president of the sorority that she wanted to be in. She just left all the cheerleaders who, by all intents and purposes in Sydney's mind, have it all figured out. And she's descending into this hell. And when she hits the send button on the text message back to Lauren saying, I'm home, and there's 7 E's on the end of it, she wants to project sanity. That's what she's hiding. What do we know about the next day? What we know is this timeline. And before we get to the timeline, I'm sorry. Lauren does say to you, everything was okay. And when Sydney left at 11 o'clock or so on March 2nd, she seemed okay. And Steve Powell said, she seemed okay. She seemed fine. So think about that. What's going on there? What's the alternative? Can Lauren or Steve say to themselves, I missed it? Maybe I missed something? Because that is a hard burden to carry. And I certainly understand why they said what they said. But we're looking at the facts and the evidence and what happened. And what we know is Sydney goes home, and Steve sees her on Life 360. He's at the house between 11 and 11:30. About 11:15 or so, he calls Brenda from Sydney's phone. He says, can you come here? I don't know what's going on. Something's going on with school. He knows that she's not enrolled because he's been trying to log in through the email, and they say she's not enrolled. And Steve says, Brenda's better at this than me. And he leaves. We know from the cell phone records, and Detective Whitten verified this, that Brenda tells Steve at 11:49, I'm pulling in the driveway now. So 11:49 to that first call, 12:36. Is that 47 minutes? So Brenda and Sydney are alone in the house for 47 minutes, and Brenda's doing what Brenda does. She's trying to figure it out in a loving and supportive way. What's going on? Your dad's saying this. What do you mean? I don't understand, unenrolled. For 47 minutes. You think Brenda's yelling and screaming at Sydney for 47 minutes? Absolutely not. And they're trying to work it out. And Brenda calls Mount Union and speaks to Teresa. And Teresa tells her, or she tells Teresa, I'm sorry, how could Sydney be unenrolled as a student at Mount Union University? And Teresa writes down in the note memo, Sydney was there sitting by her. And Detective Whitten interviewed Teresa, and Dean Frazier talked to Teresa. And Brenda's not mad when that call comes in. She's not telling Teresa, my daughter's upset, she's freaking out, she's inconsolable. She's just trying to figure stuff out. And then we know when Mount Union calls back at 12:36 and 45 seconds, it's a short phone call, 15 or 20 seconds. But we also know that there's no evidence at all of any argument or fight before that. I asked Detective Whitten that. He agreed. No evidence of any argument or fight. They took pictures of the whole house. There's no furniture in disarray or anything like that. And neither Dean Frazier or Dean Gaffney reported any concern in Brenda's voice. No yelling, no screaming, no agitation. She was calm and she was rational. And 15 to 20 seconds into that call, Sydney snapped. And there was a psychotic break. And she did commit the acts that led to Brenda's death. And they are awful and they are horrific. And they scream out insanity. They scream out insanity for that 3.5 minutes. And when Mount Union calls back, because they're concerned, they've heard these horrible thuds and the punching and the screaming, and they're concerned with good reason. And what I remember Dean Gaffney saying is, I said on the phone, Brenda, are you okay? If you don't pick up, we're going to call the police. Detective Whitten, when I asked him that question, he remembers Dean Gaffney saying, do you need us to call the police? The police were mentioned right there at 12:40 and 15 seconds. And Dr. Obradovich and the prosecution wants you to think, well, there wasn't a whole lot of time to do a lot of stuff. I mean, look at this timeline. It's 27 minutes from the first Mount Union call at 12:36 to 1:02 when Officer Jackson activates his body cam and he enters the house. 27 minutes. What was going on in those 27 minutes? We have 14 minutes lapse from This Is Brenda, which was at 12:40, to Steve and Sydney talking. That's 14 minutes. When Steve said the police are on their way, another 8 minutes goes by. That is a long time. What we heard from Dr. Reardon is this idea of dissociation. And we heard it from Dr. And we heard it from Dr. Tinney. And Dr. Obradovich has even made this diagnosis of borderline personality disorder that contains an element of identity dissociation. Dr. Obradovich said that. Well, what is dissociation? It's when you're someone else. It's weird, and it's extreme, and it's also real. That's what the medicine tells us. That's what the science tells us. And do you think for a second that Sydney, after this 3.5 minutes, in her sane mind, is able to calmly say, "This is Brenda," on the phone? What happened? What happened during that next 14 minutes? I'm going to submit to you that what we know is these psychotic breaks, they wax and they wane. That's what you heard. You heard that from Dr. Swales, and Dr. Tinney, and Dr. Reardon. And you know what? Dr. Swales knows, because he served 19 years in the Metro Health Cleveland psychiatric ward. 19 years where he treated schizophrenic patients. And he saw them. He saw them with his own eyes engage in psychotic behavior, violent psychotic breaks. And I said, Dr. Swells, tell the jury what that looks like. What are you seeing when someone who has schizophrenia is in a violent psychotic break? And he said, they have no idea what's going on. And they have no idea what they're doing. And we have to restrain them and tie them down sometimes so they don't hurt themselves or others. And when they come out of it, they have very little memory of what's going on. And there are moments and flashes where they can communicate. You know who else we heard that from? We heard that from Amanda Brown. Amanda now works in the intensive care unit, pediatric division at Akron Children's Hospital. And before that, remember, she was a sitter at the psych ward. And she said that would happen. She'd be talking to a kiddo, and all of a sudden, like a light switch, it would flip, and that kid would do something completely out of character. And oftentimes they wouldn't remember it. So we know, after 3.5 minutes, this phone call comes in. There's talk of police. Sydney says, "This is Brenda," and she hangs up. And for the next 14 minutes, doesn't it make sense that Sydney is in some kind of dissociation, shock, catatonic state? And you saw the pictures of the house. It's not a big house. You can get anywhere in that house in 30 seconds. And imagine Sydney there in the house with her mother, and she's not leaving. That is insane. And the phone rings. And do you remember what we experienced here in court when somebody's phone rang in the back? What did that do to us? The judge first. It snapped our attention, right? That's what we're conditioned to. In Sydney, here's the phone ring. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And it's coming out of this and having some flashes of lucidity and says, "Hello?" And this phone call lasts 30 seconds. And Steve says, "Sydney, where's Mom?" She's on the phone with Mount Union. And that could have been her last memory. Well, what's going on? Why are the police coming? And Sydney is looking around the house and she sees the broken window and she sees the blood. The 30 seconds that she's on that phone, all of that could have happened. And she's telling Steve, "Oh my God, there's been a break-in. There's blood everywhere." And what happens after the next 8 minutes when she knows that the police are coming? She waits there. And the prosecution wants you to believe that that's her plan? That she's staged a crime scene, a fake crime scene, that she's thrown this something through the window, she's broken the window. And this is the plan. All I have to do now is just wait here. Wait until the police arrive, and they'll never know it was me. She doesn't clean up. She doesn't change her clothes. She doesn't move the body. She doesn't move the weapons that have her fingerprints, her DNA all over them. She doesn't get in the car and leave. Brenda's car's in the driveway. Her car's in the garage. She doesn't do any of those things because she's not thinking rationally. She's in a catatonic, psychotic break. That's what happened. And the prosecution and Ms. Obradovich, Dr. Obradovich, I'm sorry, have really done a really good job of identifying all of the stereotypes and the myths that prevent good mental health in our community. Oh, your kid is struggling with grades? Oh no, that's just a kid thing. You don't want to go out? Oh, you know what? Kids like alone time. They do. They like to be alone. How do you check and know if your kid's okay? Well, if they don't tell you anything, they must be fine. Well, you know what we can do? Here, parents, check your kid's social media account because that'll give you a really good idea of their mental health. If my kid doesn't say that she's hallucinating, then it must not be happening. You know, it's not happening. Your kid's lying. You know what? This isn't a mental health issue. This is a character flaw. And Sydney's a liar. And she's deceptive. And she's manipulative. That's who she is. If someone talked to my daughter like that, there'd be a problem. Is that what we want to say to our community about how we think about mental health? That unless your kid is Googling what happens when I'm hallucinating, that it doesn't exist? This is appalling, and it's disgusting. And you put a picture of Brenda from the internet and you want to speak for her? What's the motive? The motive is apparently all we heard was Sydney was so upset that she got suspended from school that she killed her mother. Does that make sense to you? Is that your reason and your common sense that that is absolutely true? Because if that's it, then Sydney's fooled everybody. She's fooled all the doctors. She fooled those doctors who were there that day, who saw her. She fooled the doctors during 9 days of inpatient, involuntary hospitalization who diagnosed her with schizophrenia. She fooled all three of our experts. But more importantly, she fooled Ken Dees, a police officer who knows that family for 40 plus years and told you there is no evidence at all of any dysfunction. There's no violence. That's not who they are. She fooled the teacher, Catherine Mulligan, who taught her how to ski, who took her on a religious retreat because she embodied the values of the Catholic school that she taught at. She fooled Betsy. Betsy bonded her out, and she fooled her. She's really a cold-blooded killer, and Betsy missed it. She fooled her own father, and she fooled Brenda. That's what they want you to believe? They say, trust the science. But they ignore it when there are scientific methods to determine, is this person suffering from a serious mental disease? There are proven, valid, objective, legitimate tests, and they ignore them. She's lying. We checked her media account. There are proven, valid, legitimate psychological tools to determine if someone is malingering. And Dr. Obradovich didn't do that. Why? She says, well, we can't go back and test in time, but she said, she was malingering back on March 3rd, 2020. So she tells you she can't do something, and then she tells you what she's done. It doesn't make any sense. Why did Dr. Obradovich not test? Because she got the answer she wanted. She got the answer that Joe D'Angelo wanted from her. You'll read the email. You heard her say what Prosecutor D'Angelo said. That's what happened here. So let's look at what we have provided and proven. All of these individuals who saw Sydney initially are there. They're not expert witnesses, as Dr. Timmy said. They're not paid by the defense. They're there because they happen to be working that shift on that day. And what we know is on March 3rd, within hours of Brenda's homicide, Sydney is at Akron City Hospital. And there she's seen by Todd Ivan. And what do we know about Todd Ivan? Well, Dr. Smartnick knows him. Dr. Smartnick said, I practiced with him for 30 years, and he's a good man. He's a good physician, and I would trust him implicitly. And he diagnosed Sydney within hours of acute psychosis. And he prescribed medication that is taken for schizophrenia. And he recommended she should be confined in a mental health pod and considered for involvement with the psychodiagnostic clinic and or confinement at North Coast Behavioral Health Services for forensic commitment. Within hours of Sydney being charged with murder, this doctor is saying, something ain't right. This is acute psychosis. Let me give her some medication. And you know what? I'm not here to evaluate and diagnose sanity at the time of the offense, but I know who is. Psychodiagnostic clinic. I know who is North Coast Behavioral Health. That's where she needs to go. Sydney then goes to the jail. She's there from March 4th through the 6th. And Dr. Timmy talked to you about being there, boots on the ground, when someone comes in and they are acutely psychotic. She's given a Ferguson vest, the gown that you can't rip and try to hang yourself. She's placed on suicide prevention. She's in the most secure mental health pod on the entire jail, where she has the highest level of services, and people are checking in on her. And then this thing happens, and Dr. Timmy explained it really well, where these two constitutional rights come into conflict with each other. She has a right to a bond and right to get out. But we at the jail also have to figure out, is she safe? And if she wasn't suffering from a serious mental disease, they wouldn't have sent her for involuntary commitment. The jail knows. They've seen her. They send her over to PES, Portage Path Emergency Services. And she's there for probably less than 24 hours. And again, this is triage. This isn't diagnose, treat, evaluate, counsel. This is, what are we going to do with this person? Are we going to send her home? Is she stable enough to go home? And no. This patient would benefit from inpatient psychiatric hospitalization for her safety, further evaluation, and treatment. That happens. We then know that Sydney goes to Akron General Medical Center, Cleveland Clinic, and she's there for 9 days. And this is when things can slow down a little bit. The doctors, the clinicians, the treating physician, the counselors, the psychologists can take a look at what's going on with Sydney. And these are the folks who don't have any interest other than trying to help. She's there for 9 days, and she's diagnosed with schizophrenia, paranoid type, by Dr. Farivar. And who is he? You heard from Dr. Swells, he was one of his students. And he's a good doctor. He knows what he's doing. He diagnosed Sydney with schizophrenia and describes Abilify and Depakote. antipsychotic medication for a serious mental disease. And they say trust the science. That's what the science tells you. That's what the medicine tells you. That's what the testing tells you. And Dr. Farivar asked for a psychological testing by Dr. Stevenson and Dr. Alan Gilbertson. And they confirmed the diagnosis of schizophrenia. They prescribed additional medication, Ativan for anxiety, antidepressant, trazodone, and Haldol. These are not defense experts. These are people who are telling you through their records, Sydney has a serious mental disease, schizophrenia. Please listen to them. That's the science. That's the medicine. And it works. We know that Sydney then goes to see Dr. Smartnick. And she's there from March 31st all the way up until now, today. She's a current patient. You saw Dr. Smartnick on Friday. And he diagnosed Sydney in March of 2020 with this schizoaffective disorder, which are all serious mental diseases. She's been treating with Dr. Deborah Saley, Dr. Michelle Ferrant. And Dr. Smartnick gives her medication, and he's been doing it for 3.5 years. There are breakthrough symptoms. What happens when a breakthrough symptom occurs? Sydney tells her therapist, the therapist calls the psychiatrist, and Dr. Smartnick adjusts the medication. That's how science works. That's how medicine works. You can't fake a breakthrough symptom, get medication, and respond well to it. Sydney has a favorable response to proven evidence-based treatments for schizophrenia. She was placed in an inpatient, involuntary psychiatric hospital where she was diagnosed and treated for schizophrenia, and she got a little bit better. She was subject to outpatient treatment for 3.5 years and counseling, legitimate, proven medical interventions that worked. That's the science. And Sydney somehow fooled all these people, right? She's Meryl Streep. She's been able to fool and act for 3.5 years and pull the wool over Dr. Smartnick's eyes. She pulled the wool over Todd Ivan, and she pulled the wool over Dr. Farivar. But she's not only Meryl Streep, but she's also Sigmund Freud, because she knows how to act, but she knows the psychological symptoms to act to get the right diagnosis. And she's Meryl Streep and Sigmund Freud, and she's also Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? Because she has to know something about the law. So you think that's what's going on with Sydney? That's her plan over the last 3.5 years? She's fooled all these people, and she's fooled Dr. Swales, Dr. Reardon, and Dr. Timmy. Who says to trust the science and trust the medicine and trust the psychological testing? Lieutenant Whidden did. I asked him, Detective Whidden, if the jury wants to know, because Detective Whidden again was talking about, I looked through her phone and I didn't see any evidence of serious mental disease. And I said, well, if the jury wants to know if Sydney was suffering from a severe mental illness on the date of the offense, a better witness, no disrespect other than you, would be someone who's qualified to make that diagnosis. Yes. Someone who does some testing, like personality testing, cognitive testing, tests to determine there's actually a severe mental illness or not. Yes. And you would want a psychologist or a psychiatrist to actually do the testing that determines if there is a serious mental illness or not. Yes. Who did that? Dr. Timmy, Dr. Reardon, Dr. Swales. Who didn't do that? The person who's testifying for the first time in her life on a sanity evaluation in a murder case in a trial today, Dr. Obradovich. That's who didn't do it. So we heard from Dr. Reardon. And this is where I have to prove to you by a preponderance of the evidence insanity. So we brought forth Dr. Reardon, 46 years of experience, spent 7 hours with Sydney, did all the psychological testing. And he diagnosed her with schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, psychotic features. He considered malingering. He has to. He considered it, he tested for it, and he ruled it out. And said there's a clear pattern of an individual with a genuine disorder. Sydney made no effort to overstate the symptoms. These are the valid psychological testing. This is the science to help you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, decide a very difficult question. Is she malingering? Does she have a serious mental disease or not? That's the science, and our doctors followed it. How did the state prove its case in chief? The first 3 days, remember that? They called doctors. We heard from Dr. Schott, the medical examiner. They called a scientist from BCI that talked to you about DNA. They called an expert from BCI that talked to you about blood spatter. And what did those expert witnesses do? They followed the science, and they talked to you about their methodology, right? Special Agent Borner, who did the blood spatter, didn't just go in and look around and say, here's my conclusions. The BCI analyst who looked at the DNA didn't just look at it and say, looks like Brenda and a mixture of maybe Sydney's blood. No, they did the scientific testing that their profession says, if you want to get it right, do it this way. That's the scientific method. That's what the state said pay attention to in the first days of their trial, but when we're proving it, none of that matters. The scientific method, these valid, independent, verified tests that will give you answers, ignore them. They're meaningless. Dr. Obradovich can tell you. She looked at her cell phone records. She looked at her TikTok account. And she can tell you 3 years ago that Sydney's malingering. She can tell you just by talking to her, looking at the records, she doesn't have a serious mental disease. That's what Dr. Obradovich wants you to buy. That's what they want you to buy. But we prove by a preponderance, and more than a preponderance, that Sydney is insane. Can we look at the next slide? Dr. Reardon said at the time of the offense charge, Sydney Powell, as a result of a severe mental disease, was unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of her acts charged. She was in a psychotic state, out of touch with reality, and unable to know the wrongfulness of her acts. He's putting his reputation on the line, 46 years. And he says to you, I have rarely, if ever, seen a situation where an individual was in such an utterly compromised psychological state as Sydney Powell at the time of these offenses. It's one of a handful of cases that he told you from that witness stand that live with him, where it is so obvious that someone is in a psychological break and doesn't know the wrongfulness of her conduct. 2,000 evaluations, 46 years, hours with Sydney, doing the testing, ruling out malingering, and coming to that conclusion. You heard from Dr. Swales. And again, he's been doing and observing and studying and diagnosing and treating schizophrenic patients who suffer violent outbreaks for 19 years. Imagine that job, working at the psych ward at Metro Health in Cleveland for 19 years. I mean, what didn't he see, right? He spent 23 hours with Sydney and did 20 different psychological tests. He's trying to be as exhaustive as possible. He knows you have to consider malingering. You have to when you're doing a forensic evaluation. And the only way he would consider it or rule it out or make that diagnosis is to do the testing, follow the science. What's the approved methodology? Use the best tools available. That's the scientific method. He did that. And he found He considered malingering, tested for it, and ruled it out. No evidence of feigned impairment. Valid, interpretable profile. Sidney Powell is not malingering. And he's also a neuropsychologist. He talked to you about that. And in the beginning, we're trying to figure out what is going on with Sidney. What happened on March 3rd? And we're getting some pieces of information from Akron General Medical Center and Dr. Farragar. And he's saying there's something with her temporal lobe. You guys ought to look at that. And Steve Powell does, because he wants answers. He takes his daughter to University Hospitals in June of 2020. And there, they take her off the medication. They put her in an MRI and they watch her for 6 days. And they test her. And they rule out, this isn't a cognitive problem. This isn't epilepsy. This wasn't a seizure. What's left? Dr. Swales tells you what's left is psychosis, is the mental health issue. That's what's left. So he tests her. And he tells you, in summary, it's my opinion, within a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, that at the time of the offense, the defendant, Ms. Powell, did have a severe mental disease, reversible mental illness, namely schizoaffective disorder, depressive type, first episode, in an acute episode. It's also my opinion, within a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, that at the time of the instant offense, the defendant did not know the wrongfulness of the alleged conduct. That's what he told you. And there wasn't a single follow-up question. Not one. Because you can't impeach the truth. His credentials are unassailable, and his conclusions are scientifically sound. We heard from Dr. Robin Timmy, and he's been involved really at every level of the criminal justice system. I'm just going to nerd out for a second, right? He's got kind of a cool job. He goes to the jail and he studies the jail and he says, here's how you can design a jail better to help people. That's what he does. He goes across the nation and he's been boots on the ground at the jail, in the emergency room, when someone is in acute psychotic state. He's seen it with his own eyes. Dr. Obradovich has read about it, but she's never seen it with her own eyes. Our experts have. And he saw Sidney for 5 hours. He administered the tests. He diagnosed her with a serious mental disease, schizoaffective disorder, depressive type. Malinger, he considered it, he tested for it, and he ruled it out. And he said the standardized forensic psychological testing removes the personal opinion and forces us to use a psychologist's proven scientific method of evaluating. Read that again. Removes the personal opinion. Everything you heard here from Dr. Obradovich was her personal opinion. Do we want that? Is that the scientific method? No. Follow the science. There is a method, and that method is the testing. And the testing takes away the subjective opinion of a psychologist. How does it do that? It measures the response across thousands of respondents. Thousands. So this isn't somebody throwing a dart at a dartboard. It's following the scientific method to get the best possible answer. That is overwhelming proof. And that's what Dr. Timmy did. And you heard his conclusion. Ms. Powell was raised in an intact family by parents who consistently supported her. Her childhood does not appear to include the adversity very often seen in a population of people charged with murder, nor did Ms. Powell present with any of the hallmarks of risk for violence known in the peer-reviewed literature. She had no history of violence, no history of antisocial behavior, no history of problems with employment or relationships, no history of substance abuse or major depressive disorder, No history of personality disorders or traumatic experience, no violent attitudes or problems with adherence to treatment. By all accounts, Ms. Powell and her mother were very close and confided in one another. Ms. Powell was able to rely on her mother, for support and encouragement. In fact, Ms. Powell was shocked that her mother was warm and supportive about her academic woes, even in the final moments before her death. Unfortunately, Ms. Powell was in a full-blown psychosis by that point and was completely unaware of her actions. At the time of the alleged offense, due to the active symptoms of severe mental disease, Ms. Powell was unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of her conduct. That's where the evidence takes us when you follow the science and you use the best possible tools available at the highest level of the profession. Dr. Obradovich saw Sydney for 2 hours and did no testing and claims that she's malingering back in March, but also claims, well, we can't really test for serious mental disease back in time. Why not? Because she got the answer she wanted, and she stopped. Steve Powell came to me, and I agreed to represent his daughter. And he said, treat her like...
Objection.
Sustained.
I treated her like she was mine.
Objection.
Sustained. Jury will disregard.
It's a heavy burden. And it's taken a lot of time to get this case to you. But now, you assume that burden. This is your decision now. And there's nobody on the planet that's better prepared for this decision than you. You've paid attention. You've listened through everything carefully. And I know it hasn't been easy. You know, we heard about religion, we heard about values. I was raised Catholic, and I've struggled with my faith. I've seen a lot. But I've been praying. And that's brought me some comfort and some guidance. And I hope that this brings you some comfort and guidance too. And it's 4 simple words, and it's defined everything I do in this case. Please help us